welcome to our next project, Color, Temperature, and Text Poster. So as we've moved along, we've now learned more about color, and now we've talked about color temperature. In this project, you're combining typography and creating a color palette to show a temperature. So what are you gonna do? You're gonna pick a temperature word like hot or cold or ice cold, and the example that I used is ice cold. You're going to create a color palette with 3 to 5 colors. And if you want to use black or white, they must be one of the colors in your color palette. And you're going to go to color.adobe to actually create your color palette. You are going to create your poster using the template that you're going to be downloading. And again, that's going to be your name, color, temperature, and text poster. And you'll see here at the very top, and if you go to the artboards, you can actually see there's a palettes artboard. This is where you're going to be adding each of the colors that you use. And there's also a font palette, and here you'll put any of the fonts that you use. And you might only use one font like me, or you might use 2 or 3, it's up to you. Then we have one artboard that's color temperature version 1, and guess what that means? That's where you put your first version, and color temperature 2 is where you put the second version. So you're going to create your poster using this template. You're going to use shapes, pen tools, etc., no photographs, and at least 2 versions. When I say at least, that means you can do more than 2, but 2 is the minimum. So you can see here, this is my project exemplar, and here it is right here. And I've done my color palette and my font palette, and this is my first iteration of my word ice cold. And there is a lot that you can do. And I really want you to push your creativity. Think about the whole entire artboard and how you can express your color temperature, ice cold, red hot, whatever it is you choose, with both typography and color. So what are you gonna do? First, you're gonna go to your Google Drive project folder, look for color, temperature, and text poster. You'll see right here, you have the Illustrator file for you to download. You're going to download that file, and then you're going to put it in your desktop folder and rename it from your name to your actual name, Miss G, color, temperature, and text. And like I normally recommend, you should have a folder for each project on your desktop folder. So you'll open up your template and you'll see here's your workspace. Here's where you're going to be doing your work. So first step is you're going to actually pick what your word or phrase is. Mine that I picked was ice cold. So I think ice cold, I want that to be cold. I want to use cool colors. So I could decide I want to look for my font first. I want to do my color palette first. On this page, just like always, you have all your resources. Here's where you can look for your fonts. You can look on your computer library, or you can look here. And then you're gonna also pick your color palette. So whatever order you do is up to you. And again, if you're using white or black, they need to be specifically part of your palette. And you can use 3 to 5 colors. So I've gone to color.adobe and I set my base color, and then I made a custom palette here, and I thought this to me represents ice cold. And I use these cool blue tones because I think of cold as like a blue color. So that's why I picked this, and I wanted white to be one of my colors. Just like always, you're gonna go to the hex number and you're going to select it, copy it, go to your palette here, and you would paste in that right here, and then you would go to the actual box, double click on it, make sure that you're selecting the fill color, double click on that, and then you would paste it in there and you say, okay. And that's how you would do it. And so I've already gone through and done my whole entire color palette. So you're gonna put all the colors that you're using here, and then you're gonna go in and you're gonna decide what font you wanna use and make this font your actual font. So you can see in here, I'm saying I'm using Blackout, and I've made Blackout the font Blackout so that you can see what you're doing. Now you're ready to start working. So I'm gonna show you an example with the blank one right here. So you'll notice on the template that you have, there's a palettes layer and another layer. What I recommend you do is you work on your palette, and then you lock that layer. And then what I like to do is make another layer in addition to that other layer and for just the text. So I'll rename it to background and I'll do a layer for text. And I do this because I don't want to accidentally select my background. So if I want to make a background, I can go in here and I can make sure I'm on the right layer, background, and I would draw out my background. And again, you want to be using the colors in your color palette, and you can use the little eyedropper to select the colors. And not only does the eyedropper select the colors, it also selects the fill in the stroke. So if that happens, just make sure you select the stroke and you make it none. Something very important I want you guys playing with is in the appearance panel, I want you to play with adding layers to your fill or your stroke. So for this one, you can see I liked that blue, but I also wanted to add a little texture to it. So I added another fill, and then I went into the library and I went into patterns and I went into basic graphics and I looked for graphic textures, right? And then I selected one of them, and this is the one that I selected. But you're like, wait a second, that doesn't look the same. Again, things you can play around with, and this is very similar to Photoshop, is changing the opacity and changing the blend mode. You know, so these are all different things that you can play around with. So opacity, blend mode, layers of fill. And then once I get my background, it's nice to lock it. So it's nice to separate your background and sort of your text. So then I have my text, ice cold. And if you want to see how I actually just make a text field, select T. You can either draw out the field or you can just start typing. And again, you would just select right here, blackout, and change your size, and you can change all sorts of stuff. You can set the tracking, you can do all sorts of things here. And again, everything that I'm showing you, these are options. You don't need to follow exactly of how I'm doing it. So then I want to set the color of my text to be white. So I go in here, F, 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 F. And then you're like, wait a second, it looks like you have some sort of drop shadow going on. This is when you can play with some of the effects. So if you go select your text and you go to effect, you can see there's all sorts of things you can do here. One thing that you might want to look at is Stylize, and there's a bunch of options here. And what I used is drop shadow. Here, make sure this color that you're selecting is one of your colors. So this one is, if you can't tell, is from one of my color palettes. And here you can play around with the opacity, the offset, the blur. So here's my preview. So you can see I had no blur, but I could make it blurry, like very soft, or not, or whatever. I can change the offset to be really far away. So these are things that you can play with. And then again, remember, if you don't see anything, make sure you're clicking the preview and then click OK. So that's one thing you can do. And remember, you can also add layers of strokes and layers of fills to your text as well. So now if you want to do something like I did, where I moved the text around, I added all sorts of things to it, what you can do is click Create Outlines. Now, very importantly, if you add an effect, you need to go Object, Expand Appearance. All right? Or else it won't apply the effect, and once you ungroup it, you'll lose all those effects. So now I go Ungroup and Ungroup. And now this is going to be separate from this. So you have the foreground and the background. And again, remember we're talking about color temperature. Because this is darker color and a colder color, it recedes from the white. So then what you can do is you can select these and you can size them and rotate them and do all sorts of things to them. Now, once you've gone in and I've made it, you know, how I want it, I made some of them bigger, I sort of tousled them up, I rotated some of them, and now remember they're separate, both the foreground and the background, the drop shadow and the actual letter are separate. Now you're like, how did you go in and you add those drips? So remember, depending on your word, whether it's a hot word, maybe you want to add flames. If it's a cold word, maybe you want to add drips. What you can do is you can use the shapes in the circle tool. the ellipse and hold down Shift to make a circle. I selected those two, and then I went to the Pathfinder. And if you don't have the Pathfinder, you can go Window, Pathfinder. And so if you remember the Pathfinder from previous projects, is a great way to manipulate your shapes by uniting, excluding, doing all sorts of things with them. I click Unite and they become one object. And now I can manipulate it more. So I use my direct selection tool here, and I can move things. I can make it more drippy. I can change the angles. I can do all sorts of stuff. And then I can select one of these points right here and I can convert it. And I can take this one right here and I can convert it. And then I can just go in and I can manipulate it a little bit more. So once you've sized it how you like it, then you can start going in and adding them to your shape. And remember, hold down the Alt to make a copy, and you can grab on the corners and Shift to make it bigger or smaller. And that's kind of just how I did to make the drips. And there's all sorts of things you can do. Don't be limited by just what I'm doing. Remember, you can add illustrations, you can add more stuff to the text, but think about using the text and using the colors. How can you actually convey this temperature to your viewer? And just like always, you should always be saving. So Command S, save it. And when you're all done, go File, Export, JPEG, use Artboard's export.